A barefoot 12-year-old boy raised his hand when the millionaire wagered his $2 million ranch that no one could heal his violent, chained stallion. 3 weeks later, the richest man in Texas would be on his knees, weeping. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching it from. Let's go. The sprawling Thornton Ranch stretched across 2,000 acres of prime Texas land, a kingdom of rolling pastures, pristine white fencing, and a mansion that gleamed like a crown jewel beneath the relentless summer sun. At the center of this empire stood Richard Thornton, a man whose fortune had been built on oil, cattle, and an unshakable belief that money could solve any problem the world dared to present him. His boots, handmade Italian leather, worth more than most families earned in a month, kicked up small clouds of dust as he strode toward the main corral, where a crowd had gathered to witness what he considered the greatest spectacle of the season. What nobody expected was that a 12-year-old boy with bare feet and patched jeans would change everything that afternoon, leaving everyone speechless and the millionaire's pride in ruins. The horse in question was named Tempest, a magnificent chestnut stallion with a white blaze running down his face like a streak of lightning frozen in time. Once, Tempest had been the pride of Thornton's collection, a champion jumper who had won trophies that now gathered dust in the mansion's trophy room. But something had broken inside the animal 6 months ago, something that no veterinarian, no trainer, no specialist flown in from across the country could identify or repair. The horse had become violent, unpredictable, refusing to let anyone approach without lashing out with hooves that could shatter bone. Heavy chains now bound him to the ground, a sight that made several of the gathered ranch hands look away in shame and discomfort. Richard Thornton had tried everything his considerable wealth could buy. He had brought in the finest equine specialists from Kentucky, trainers renowned throughout Europe, even a supposed horse whisperer from Montana, whose methods had been featured in national magazines. Each one had left defeated, some with injuries, all with the same conclusion written across their frustrated faces. The horse was beyond saving, they said. The kindest thing would be to put him down and end his suffering. But Richard Thornton was not a man who accepted failure, not in business, not in life, and certainly not when it came to a horse that had cost him $300,000. That morning, Richard had made an announcement that had spread through the small town like wildfire through dry brush. He stood on the porch of the main house, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd of ranch workers, neighboring farmers, and curious townspeople who had come to see what the commotion was about. His declaration was simple and outrageous in equal measure. Anyone who could cure Tempest, who could restore the horse to even a shadow of his former glory, would win the entire Thornton Ranch, all $2 million worth of land, livestock, and buildings. The crowd had laughed nervously, certain it was a joke, but the hard glint in Richard's eyes told them otherwise. Among the spectators stood a boy named Elijah Cole, though everyone in town simply called him Eli. He was small for his 12 years, with sandy hair that hadn't seen a proper cut in months, and eyes the color of worn copper pennies. His clothes told the story of a life lived on the margins, a faded plaid shirt that had belonged to his father before the accident, jeans patched so many times they were more thread than denim, and feet that had grown accustomed to the feel of bare earth because shoes were a luxury his grandmother couldn't always afford. He had come to the ranch that day hoping to find work, any work that might bring a few dollars home to the small cabin where he lived with his ailing grandmother on the edge of town. Eli watched as Tempest thrashed against his chains, the horse's eyes rolling with a fear and fury that seemed to consume his entire being. The ranch hands kept their distance, and even the bravest among them flinched when the stallion's hooves struck the ground with thunderous force. But Eli saw something else in those wild eyes, something that the wealthy specialists and professional trainers had apparently missed. He saw pain, not just physical but something deeper, a wound of the spirit that chains and force could never heal. Without fully understanding why, the boy felt his heart reach out to the tormented creature. When Richard Thornton repeated his challenge, his voice dripping with the condescension of a man who had never been proven wrong, Eli felt his hand rise almost of its own accord. The movement was small, hesitant, but it caught the attention of one of the ranch hands who let out a bark of surprised laughter. The sound rippled through the crowd, and suddenly all eyes were on the barefoot boy with his raised hand and his threadbare clothes. Richard Thornton turned slowly, his expression shifting from amusement to irritation as he took in the sight of this unlikely challenger. The millionaire approached Eli with deliberate steps, his shadow falling over the boy like a storm cloud blocking the sun. Up close, Richard Thornton was an imposing figure, broad-shouldered and weathered by years of commanding men and conquering obstacles. His eyes, cold as the silver buckle on his belt, studied Eli with the same calculating gaze he used when evaluating livestock at auction. The crowd fell silent, sensing that something significant was about to unfold, though none could have predicted just how dramatically this encounter would reshape all their lives. "You," Richard said, the single word laden with disbelief and derision. "You think you can do what the best trainers in the country could not?" The question hung in the air like the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, and Eli could feel their eyes boring into him, some pitying, others curious, a few openly mocking. His grandmother had always told him that pride was a sin, but standing there before the most powerful man in the county, Eli discovered something that felt stronger than pride. It was certainty, quiet and unshakable, that he was meant to be here at this exact moment. "I can try, sir," Eli replied, his voice steady despite the thundering of his heart. The simplicity of his answer seemed to catch Richard off guard. Most people approached him with elaborate promises or desperate pleas, but this boy offered neither. He simply stood there, small and seemingly insignificant, yet somehow unafraid. Richard studied him for a long moment, then threw back his head and laughed, a sound that echoed off the barn walls and sent a nearby flock of birds scattering into the sky. The laughter spread through the crowd like a contagion, and Eli felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment. But he did not lower his hand, did not step back, did not allow his gaze to waver from the millionaire's face. There was something in the boy's stillness that gradually silenced the mockery, something that made even Richard Thornton's laughter fade into an uncomfortable cough. The rancher wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and regarded the boy with renewed interest, the way a cat might study a mouse that had suddenly stopped running. "Fine," Richard said, his voice carrying a sharp edge of cruel amusement. "You want to try your luck with that beast, boy? Go ahead. But know this, when you fail, and you will fail, I expect you to tell everyone in that miserable little town of yours that Richard Thornton's horse cannot be cured. I want you to spread the word that I was right to put him down, that there was nothing anyone could do." Eli nodded slowly, accepting the terms, though his mind was already elsewhere, already focused on the chestnut stallion who had stopped at thrashing and was watching the exchange with ears pricked forward. The crowd parted as Eli walked toward the corral, their whispers following him like autumn leaves caught in a wind. Some shook their heads in pity, certain they were about to witness a tragedy. Others watched with morbid curiosity, the same fascination that draws people to watch storms approach from the safety of their porches. A few of the ranch hands exchanged worried glances and positioned themselves near the fence, ready to intervene if the horse attacked the boy. But something in Eli's unhurried pace, in the quiet confidence of his movements, made them hesitate to stop him. Tempest stood in the center of the corral, his powerful body trembling with tension, his eyes tracking Eli's approach with a mixture of fear and defiance. The chains that bound him clinked softly as he shifted his weight, testing their strength for the 1,000th time. Up close, the horse was even more magnificent than Eli had realized, despite the dullness that suffering had brought to his coat and the scars that marked where he had injured himself fighting against his restraints. The boy stopped at the fence, simply looking, making no move to enter the enclosure. For nearly 20 minutes, Eli stood motionless at the fence while the crowd grew restless behind him. Richard Thornton checked his expensive watch repeatedly, his impatience building like pressure in a steam engine. Several people began to drift away, convinced that the boy had lost his nerve and would slink off in defeat. But Eli remained where he was, his copper penny eyes never leaving the horse, his breathing slow and deliberate. He was listening to something that the others could not hear, reading a language written in the twitch of ears, the flare of nostrils, the subtle shifts of muscle beneath scarred hide. When Eli finally climbed through the fence rails, the collective gasp from the crowd was audible. Two ranch hands started forward, but Richard held up a hand to stop them, his curiosity now outweighing his certainty of failure. The boy moved differently once inside the corral, his steps becoming even slower, his body somehow smaller, less threatening. He did not approach Tempest directly, but instead began walking in a wide arc around the horse, keeping his eyes lowered, his shoulders rounded, his entire posture communicating something that words could never express. Tempest watched this strange dance with visible confusion. Every human who had entered his space in the past 6 months had come at him with ropes, with sedatives, with force and fear barely concealed behind professional confidence. But this small creature moved like no human the horse had ever encountered. There was no aggression in his movements, no hidden intention waiting to spring forth. The boy simply existed in the same space, asking for nothing, demanding nothing, offering only his quiet presence like a gift with no strings attached. An hour passed, then 2. The sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the windows of the Thornton mansion. Most of the crowd had dispersed, returning to their own lives and responsibilities, though small groups lingered at a distance, unwilling to miss whatever outcome this strange standoff might produce. Richard Thornton had retreated to the shade of the barn, but his eyes never left the corral, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. Inside the enclosure, something remarkable was beginning to happen. Tempest's trembling had subsided, his breathing had slowed, and though he still watched Eli with wary attention, the wild rolling of his eyes had calmed. The horse had stopped testing his chains, stopped fighting against the restraints that held him. Instead, he stood almost peacefully, his head lowering inch by inch as the tension drained from his powerful frame. Eli continued his patient circling, occasionally pausing to stand still, occasionally sitting in the dust with his back to the horse in a display of trust that made the watching ranch hands hold their breath. As twilight settled over the ranch, Eli finally spoke for the first time since entering the corral. His voice was soft, barely above a whisper, and the words themselves mattered less than the tone in which they were delivered. He spoke of his grandmother and her small garden, of the creek behind their cabin where minnows darted through clear water, of the way morning mist rose from the fields like spirits dancing in the early light. He spoke of loss and loneliness, of knowing what it felt like to be different, to be judged, to be dismissed by those who could not see past the surface of things. Tempest's ears swiveled forward, capturing every sound, every nuance of the boy's gentle voice. Something stirred in the horse's damaged spirit, a recognition that went beyond species, beyond the barriers that separated human from animal. Here was a creature who understood suffering, who knew the weight of chains both visible and invisible. Here was someone who asked nothing but offered everything, whose presence brought not fear, but an unexpected comfort that the stallion had almost forgotten could exist. When full darkness finally claimed the ranch, Richard Thornton ordered the boy to leave. "Tomorrow," he said gruffly, his voice betraying an uncertainty he had not felt in years. "You can try again tomorrow." Eli nodded and climbed back through the fence rails, his bare feet silent on the packed earth. But as he walked away, he heard something that made him pause and smile despite his exhaustion. Behind him, in the corral, Tempest let out a soft nicker, a sound the ranch hands said they had not heard from the horse in over 6 months. Eli walked the 3 miles back to his grandmother's cabin, with the stars as his only companions, his mind replaying every moment of the afternoon and evening. The dirt road was familiar beneath his bare feet, every stone and rut memorized through years of walking this same path to and from school, to and from the odd jobs that helped keep food on their table. But tonight the journey felt different, charged with a significance that made even the ordinary landscape seem transformed. The boy carried with him the memory of that soft nicker, that small sound that represented a crack in the wall Tempest had built around his wounded heart. His grandmother was waiting on the porch when he arrived, her frail form wrapped in a shawl despite the warmth of the summer night. Martha Cole had raised Eli since he was 4 years old, since the accident that had taken both his parents in a single terrible moment on a rain-slicked highway. She had given up her comfortable retirement in the city to bring him here, to this small cabin that had belonged to her own grandparents, believing that a boy needed space to grow and heal. Now 73 and weakened by a heart condition that required medicines they could barely afford, she watched her grandson approach with eyes that saw far more than he realized. "You went to the Thornton place," she said, a statement rather than a question. Eli nodded and sat down on the porch steps at her feet, the way he had done since he was small enough to fit in her lap. He told her everything, from the chained horse to the millionaire's mocking challenge to the hours he had spent simply being present with Tempest. Martha listened without interruption, her gnarled fingers gently stroking his hair as his words tumbled out in a rush of excitement and hope. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. "Your grandfather had the same gift," she finally said, her voice soft with memory. "Animals trusted him in ways they never trusted other folks. He used to say that most people talk too much and listen too little, that creatures understand silence better than words." Eli looked up at her, surprised. He had heard stories about his grandfather, who had died before he was born, but never this particular detail. Martha smiled and cupped his face in her weathered hands. "You have his heart, child. Whatever happens with that horse, remember that your worth is not measured by whether you succeed or fail in the eyes of men like Richard Thornton." The next morning, Eli rose before dawn and made the long walk back to the ranch. The sky was still painted in shades of purple and gray when he arrived, and the main house stood dark and silent. But the boy did not approach the house. Instead, he made his way directly to the corral where Tempest waited, the horse's silhouette gradually becoming visible as the light grew stronger. The stallion was standing at the far end of the enclosure, his head turned toward the direction from which Eli approached, as if he had been waiting. This time, Eli did not hesitate at the fence. He climbed through the rails with quiet confidence and began his patient circling once more, picking up where he had left off the night before. Tempest watched him with less suspicion now, his body language softer, more curious than defensive. The chains still bound him, but the horse no longer strained against them with the desperate fury of previous days. Something had shifted in the animal's perception. Some small but significant change in how he viewed this strange boy who asked for nothing and threatened nothing. By the time the sun had fully risen and the ranch hands began emerging from the bunkhouse, Eli had reduced the distance between himself and the horse by half. He sat cross-legged in the dust, perhaps 15 feet from Tempest, speaking in that same gentle murmur he had used the day before. The horse's ears were pricked forward, his nostrils flaring as he took in the boy's scent, his dark eyes following every small movement with intense attention. When Javier, the head ranch hand, approached the corral with a bucket of grain for the horse's morning feeding, Tempest barely acknowledged him. All the stallion's focus remained fixed on Eli. Word of the boy's return spread quickly through the ranch, and by mid-morning a small crowd had gathered once again. Richard Thornton emerged from the mansion around 10 o'clock, his expression a mixture of irritation and grudging curiosity. He had not slept well, troubled by dreams he could not quite remember, and a nagging sense that his carefully ordered world was being disrupted by forces he could not control. The sight of Eli sitting calmly in the corral, closer to Tempest than anyone had been able to get in months, did nothing to improve his mood. "What's your game, boy?" Richard muttered to himself, watching from the shade of the barn. Nobody did anything for free in his experience. Everyone wanted something, had an angle, played for advantage. The idea that this ragged child might simply want to help the horse with no ulterior motive was so foreign to Richard's understanding of human nature that he could not accept it. There had to be something else, some hidden agenda that would reveal itself in time. He resolved to watch closely and discover what the boy was really after. Inside the corral, Eli remained oblivious to the speculation and suspicion swirling around him. His entire world had narrowed to this circle of packed earth, this suffering creature, this delicate dance of trust being slowly constructed one moment at a time. He had begun to understand what had happened to Tempest, not through any explanation or examination, but through a deeper knowing that came from simply paying attention. The horse carried wounds that went far beyond any physical injury, scars of betrayal and abandonment that had festered in the darkness of his spirit. Around noon, something extraordinary happened. Tempest took a single step toward Eli. It was just one step, hesitant and immediately regretted, the horse freezing in place as if startled by his own impulse. But it was enough. A murmur of amazement rippled through the watching crowd, and even Richard Thornton leaned forward, his eyes widening with surprise. Eli did not react, did not reach out, did not make any movement that might spook the horse. He simply remained where he was, his presence an invitation without pressure, an open door that Tempest could choose to walk through whenever he was ready. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the corral, but Eli barely noticed the heat. His attention remained fixed on Tempest, on the subtle shifts in the horse's posture that spoke volumes to those patient enough to listen. Since that single step forward, the stallion had not moved again, but neither had he retreated. He stood watching Eli with an intensity that seemed almost contemplative, as if he were weighing some internal decision of enormous importance. The chains that bound him clinked softly whenever he shifted his weight, a constant reminder of the captivity that had defined his existence for the past 6 months. As the hours passed, Eli began to piece together fragments of understanding about what had broken inside this magnificent creature. He noticed how Tempest flinched whenever a shadow passed overhead, how his ears flattened at the sound of men's voices raised in casual conversation near the barn. The horse's reactions told a story of fear that went deeper than any physical trauma, a story of trust shattered so completely that the very concept of safety had become foreign to him. Eli recognized that kind of damage because he had felt it himself in the dark days after his parents' death. Richard Thornton spent most of the afternoon on his phone, conducting business from the shade of the barn, while keeping one eye on the corral. His voice carried across the yard in sharp bursts of negotiation and command, the voice of a man accustomed to making things happen through sheer force of will. But every few minutes his gaze would drift back to the boy on the horse, and something like uncertainty would flicker across his weathered features. He had built his fortune on the ability to read people and situations, to anticipate outcomes and position himself advantageously. This situation defied all his usual calculations. Late in the afternoon, Javier approached Richard with his hat in his hands, a gesture of respect that the ranch hand had perfected over 15 years of service. "Boss, there's something you should know about that horse," he said quietly, his eyes darting toward the corral. "Some of the boys have been talking, remembering things from before Tempest went bad." Richard turned his full attention to the man, sensing that something important was about to be revealed. Javier swallowed hard and continued. "It was around the time you had that trainer come in, the one from California. Marcus Webb, his name was." Richard's expression darkened at the mention of the name. Webb had come highly recommended, a specialist in breaking difficult horses, known throughout the racing circuit for his ability to produce results quickly. He had spent 2 weeks with Tempest behind closed doors, and Richard had asked no questions about his methods because the results had initially seemed promising. The horse had become obedient, compliant, responding to commands with mechanical precision. Then Webb had left, his fee paid in full, and within days Tempest had begun his descent into the violent, unreachable creature he had become. "What about him?" Richard asked, his voice carefully neutral. Javier looked down at his boots, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to say. Some of the younger hands, they heard things at night coming from the training barn, sounds they didn't want to investigate. And after Webb left, one of them found some equipment hidden in the hay storage, things that no decent trainer would ever use on an animal. The implication hung in the air between them, heavy and damning. Richard felt something twist in his gut, a sensation he barely recognized as guilt. In the corral, Eli had moved closer to Tempest without consciously deciding to do so. The distance between them had shrunk to perhaps 6 feet, close enough that the boy could see the individual scars marking the horse's body, the places where hair had grown back white over healed wounds, close enough to see the depth of pain still swimming in those dark eyes. Eli spoke softly, His words meant only for the horse, telling Tempest about the creek behind his grandmother's cabin, where wild horses sometimes came to drink at dawn. As twilight approached, Eli slowly rose to his feet, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. Tempest tensed but did not retreat, his muscles quivering beneath his scarred hide. The boy extended his hand, not reaching toward the horse, but simply holding it open in the space between them, and offering without demand. For a long moment, neither moved, and the watching crowd held its collective breath. Then, with aching slowness, Tempest stretched his neck forward and touched his velvet muzzle to Eli's palm. The contact lasted only a second before Tempest jerked back, snorting with alarm at his own boldness. But that single touch had changed everything. It was proof that healing was possible, that the walls the horse had built could be breached by patience and genuine compassion. Eli smiled, the first real smile that had crossed his face in longer than he could remember, and he heard scattered applause from the people watching at the fence. He did not turn to acknowledge them. This moment belonged to Tempest, not to any audience. Richard Thornton watched from the shadows of the barn, his conversation with Javier still echoing in his mind. He had always considered himself a practical man, someone who made decisions based on logic and profit rather than sentiment. But standing there, watching a barefoot boy accomplish what his money could not, he felt the foundations of his worldview beginning to crack. If what Javier said was true, then he bore responsibility for what had been done to Tempest. His impatience, his willingness to pursue results without questioning methods, had broken something precious. That night, as Eli prepared to leave, Richard intercepted him at the main gate. The millionaire stood blocking the path, his shadow long in the light of the rising moon. The boy stopped, looking up at the man who towered over him, and waited without speaking. Richard struggled to find words, an unfamiliar experience for someone who had spent decades commanding boardrooms and negotiations. Finally, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded bill, pressing it into Eli's hand. "For your trouble," he said gruffly. "Come back tomorrow." The boy looked down at the money, $100 more than he had ever held at one time in his life. Then he looked back up at Richard, his copper penny eyes reflecting something that made the older man distinctly uncomfortable. He could not know that Eli was seeing past his wealth and power to the doubt beginning to bloom beneath. The days began to blur together in a rhythm that felt almost sacred to Eli. Each morning he rose before dawn, ate whatever simple breakfast his grandmother had prepared, and walked the 3 miles to Thornton Ranch with the first light painting the eastern sky. Each evening he returned home exhausted, but filled with a quiet joy that sustained him through the night. The $100 Richard had given him that first night had been spent on his grandmother's medicine and a new pair of shoes that she insisted he needed, though Eli still preferred to go barefoot when working with Tempest. By the 5th day, Eli could stand beside the horse without Tempest flinching away. By the 7th day, he could run his hands along the stallion's neck, feeling the powerful muscles gradually relax beneath his touch. The chain still bound the horse, a precaution that Richard insisted upon despite the obvious progress. But Tempest no longer fought against them. Instead, he seemed to have accepted them as a temporary inconvenience, something that would be removed when the time was right. His eyes, once wild with fear and fury, had begun to clear, revealing an intelligence and sensitivity that the trauma had nearly destroyed. The ranch hands watched this transformation with a mixture of amazement and shame. Many of them had been present during Marcus Webb's training sessions, had heard the sounds Javier mentioned but had chosen to ignore them. They had told themselves that Webb was an expert, that whatever he was doing was necessary to handle such a difficult horse. Now, watching a 12-year-old boy accomplish through kindness what Webb's cruelty had only worsened, they were forced to confront their own complicity. Several of them began leaving small gifts for Eli, sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, bottles of cold water, a worn but still serviceable hat to protect him from the sun. Richard Thornton found himself spending more time near the corral than his business interests should have allowed. He told himself he was simply protecting his investment, ensuring that the boy did not harm the valuable animal or somehow cheat his way to claiming the ranch. But in truth, he was drawn by something he could not name, a fascination with the quiet drama unfolding before him. He had spent his entire adult life believing that power and money were the ultimate forces in the world, the levers by which all things could be moved and controlled. This boy, with his patched clothes and gentle hands, was proving him wrong in ways that left him deeply unsettled. On the 10th day, Eli asked Richard to remove the chains. The request came quietly, almost casually, as the boy stood beside Tempest in the early morning light. The horse stood calmly, his head lowered, his breath warm against Eli's shoulder. Richard stared at the boy for a long moment, then looked at the horse who had injured 3 of his best handlers and sent 1 trainer to the hospital with a shattered collarbone. Every instinct honed by decades of risk assessment told him to refuse, to maintain the precautions that kept everyone safe. But something in Eli's steady gaze made him hesitate. "He's not ready," Richard finally said, though his voice lacked conviction. Eli simply nodded and returned his attention to Tempest, showing no disappointment, no frustration at the refusal. He continued his work as if the conversation had never happened, stroking the horse's neck and murmuring words too soft for anyone else to hear. But later that afternoon, when Richard looked out from his office window, he saw Eli sitting in the dust with his back against Tempest's front legs, the horse standing protectively over him like a guardian watching over a sleeping child. That night, Richard made some phone calls, using his considerable resources to track down Marcus Webb. What he learned made him physically ill. Webb had been dismissed from 2 previous positions for animal cruelty, his methods involving techniques designed to break a horse's spirit through pain and fear. He had changed his name and moved west to escape his reputation, finding new clients who valued results over ethics. Richard listened to the accounts of former employers and fellow trainers, each story adding another weight to the guilt settling in his chest. He had invited this monster onto his ranch, had paid him handsomely to destroy his finest horse. The next morning, Richard arrived at the corral before Eli did. He stood alone in the gray pre-dawn light, looking at Tempest, really looking at him for perhaps the first time since acquiring him at auction 3 years ago. The horse watched him with wary eyes, and Richard saw in that gaze the reflection of his own failures. He had treated this magnificent creature as a possession, a symbol of his wealth and status, never considering that it might have needs beyond feed and shelter. The chains that bound Tempest were not so different from the chains Richard had placed on everyone in his life, the expectations and demands that kept people in their proper places. When Eli arrived, he found Richard already inside the corral, standing at a careful distance from Tempest. The millionaire's face was haggard, marked by a sleepless night and the weight of uncomfortable realizations. He held a key in his hand, the key to the padlocks that secured the chains around Tempest's legs. Without a word, he extended it toward Eli, an offering that represented far more than simple permission. It was an admission of wrongdoing, an acknowledgement that the boy understood something Richard had spent his whole life failing to grasp. Eli took the key and knelt beside Tempest, his movements slow and deliberate. The horse watched with ears pricked forward, somehow sensing the significance of the moment. One by one, Eli unlocked the padlocks and removed the chains, the heavy links falling away to coil in the dust like shed snakeskins. When the last restraint was removed, Tempest stood motionless for a long moment, as if unable to believe his own freedom. Then he took a step, tentative and wondering, followed by another, his legs moving without impediment for the first time in 6 months. Richard watched as Tempest walked slowly around the corral, testing his liberty, rediscovering movement without pain or restriction. The horse kept returning to Eli's side, touching his shoulder with that velvet muzzle, then moving away again in widening circles. It was a dance of trust and freedom, beautiful in its simplicity, and Richard felt something crack open in his chest. He turned away before anyone could see the tears forming in his eyes, retreating to his office where he could process these unfamiliar emotions in private. Word of Eli's progress with Tempest spread far beyond the boundaries of Thornton Ranch. Neighboring ranchers who had dismissed the story as exaggeration came to see for themselves, standing at the corral fence with expressions of disbelief as they watched the barefoot boy walk freely beside the horse that had once been considered too dangerous to approach. Local newspapers sent reporters, and soon photographers were capturing images of Eli and Tempest that would appear in publications across the state. The humble boy from the cabin at the edge of town had become something of a celebrity, though the attention seemed to trouble him more than please him. Through it all, Eli remained focused on his work with Tempest, treating each day as another step in a journey that had no fixed destination. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that healing was not a straight line, but a winding path with setbacks and breakthroughs that could not be predicted or controlled. There were still moments when Tempest would startle at a sudden noise, when old fears would surface and send tremors through his powerful frame. During these times, Eli would simply stand beside him, a calm presence in the storm, waiting for the panic to subside and trust to reassert itself. Richard Thornton found himself drawn into this process in ways he had never anticipated. He began spending hours at the corral each day, not supervising or evaluating, but simply watching and learning. The boy's methods fascinated him. The way Eli seemed to communicate with Tempest through silence and stillness rather than commands and corrections. It was the opposite of everything Richard had believed about leadership and control, yet the results were undeniable. The horse that his money and experts had failed to reach was being transformed by a child who possessed nothing but patience and an open heart. One afternoon, as clouds gathered on the horizon promising the first rain in weeks, Richard approached Eli during a break in the training. The boy was sitting on the fence rail, sharing an apple with Tempest, the horse's lips gently taking pieces from his outstretched palm. Richard leaned against the fence beside him, his expensive boots planted in the same dust that covered Eli's bare feet. For a long moment neither spoke, watching the clouds build and tumble across the darkening sky. "How did you know?" Richard finally asked. "How did you know you could help him when everyone else had failed?" Eli considered the question, his young face thoughtful in the gray light. He broke off another piece of apple and offered it to Tempest before answering. "I did not know," he said simply. "I just saw that he was hurting and I wanted to help. The rest happened because I listened, instead of trying to make him listen to me." Richard nodded slowly, recognizing in those words a wisdom that most adults never achieved. The rain began to fall, gentle at first, then building to a steady downpour that sent the ranch hands running for shelter. But Eli remained on the fence, and Tempest remained beside him, both seemingly unbothered by the water streaming down their faces. Richard retreated to the barn, but could not bring himself to leave entirely. He stood in the doorway, watching as boy and horse shared the storm, their silhouettes blurred by the rain, but somehow more vivid for it. Something was changing in Richard Thornton, something fundamental that he did not yet have words to describe. That evening, after the rain had passed and the sun emerged to paint the wet world in shades of gold, Richard invited Eli to dinner at the main house. The boy hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of entering that grand mansion, but eventually agreed when Richard mentioned that his cook had prepared enough food to feed a small army. They walked together up the long driveway, an unlikely pair whose paths had crossed in ways neither could have predicted, and the ranch hands who witnessed their passing exchanged looks of surprise and speculation. The dining room of the Thornton mansion was larger than Eli's entire cabin, its walls lined with paintings of horses and hunting scenes, its table long enough to seat 20 guests. Richard had the cook set 2 places at one end, facing each other across a modest distance that felt both intimate and formal. The food was unlike anything Eli had ever tasted, rich dishes with names he could not pronounce, served on china that probably cost more than his grandmother's monthly income. But what struck him most was the loneliness evident in every corner of the room, the emptiness of a home built for entertaining that rarely saw guests. Richard talked more freely than he had in years, perhaps loosened by the wine he was drinking, or perhaps by the strange comfort he found in the boy's presence. He spoke of his wife, who had left him 15 years ago, tired of playing second place to his business ambitions. He spoke of his daughter, who lived in New York and rarely called, who had made clear that she wanted nothing to do with the ranch or the life he had built. He spoke of the emptiness that success had brought, the realization that he had spent his life acquiring things that could not fill the hollow places in his heart. Eli listened without judgment, the same way he listened to Tempest, and Richard found himself revealing truths he had never spoken aloud. The millionaire confessed that he had known, on some level, that Marcus Webb's methods were cruel. He had chosen not to ask questions because he wanted results, because winning was more important than how the winning was achieved. The guilt he felt over what had been done to Tempest was just the latest in a long line of compromises that had slowly eroded his soul. By the time he finished speaking, the candles had burned low and the night pressed dark against the windows. Eli remained quiet for a moment after Richard fell silent, his copper-penny eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight. Then he spoke, his voice soft but clear in the hushed room. "My grandmother says that the measure of a person is not in the mistakes they make, but in what they do after they realize they were wrong. Tempest does not care about what happened before. He only knows what is happening now." Richard stared at the boy, struck by the simple profundity of his words. In that moment, he understood that Eli had been healing more than just a horse. He had been offering Richard the same gift he had given Tempest, the possibility of redemption. 3 weeks had passed since Eli first raised his hand to accept Richard Thornton's challenge, and in that time, Tempest had transformed from a chained and broken creature into something approaching his former glory. The horse moved freely now, his coat regaining its luster, his eyes bright with an intelligence that had been buried beneath layers of trauma. He followed Eli around the ranch like a loyal dog, and the sight of the barefoot boy walking alongside the magnificent stallion had become so common that even the most skeptical ranch hands had stopped remarking on it. But the true test of Tempest's recovery was yet to come. Richard had been thinking about the challenge he had issued, the promise that whoever cured Tempest would win the ranch. At the time, it had been an empty boast, a way of proving that the horse was beyond saving and that his decision to put him down would be justified. He had never imagined that a 12-year-old boy would actually succeed where professionals had failed. Now he found himself in an uncomfortable position, bound by a public promise that could cost him everything he had spent his life building. The honorable thing would be to fulfill his word, but honor had never been Richard's strongest virtue. The other ranchers in the county had not forgotten the challenge either. They gathered at the local feed store and the church social, speculating about what would happen now that the horse appeared to be cured. Some said Richard would find a way to weasel out of his promise, citing some technicality or claiming that the horse was not truly healed. Others believed he would honor his word, though they said this with the skepticism of people who had known Richard Thornton for decades and had witnessed his ruthless business practices firsthand. Bets were placed, rumors circulated, and the whole county waited to see what would happen. Eli remained oblivious to most of this speculation, focused as he was on his work with Tempest. But his grandmother heard the talk when she made her weekly trip to town for supplies, and she worried about what it might mean for her grandson. She knew that men like Richard Thornton did not become wealthy by keeping promises that cost them money, and she feared that Eli's hopes would be crushed by the harsh realities of the adult world. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching fireflies dance in the darkness, she tried to prepare him for disappointment. "Whatever happens with the ranch," she said carefully, "you have already accomplished something wonderful. That horse is alive and healthy because of you. No one can take that away, no matter what promises are kept or broken." Eli nodded, understanding what she was trying to tell him, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He had never truly believed he would win the ranch, had never even considered what he would do with such a vast property. His only goal from the beginning had been to help Tempest, to heal the wounds that others had inflicted. Everything else was noise. But fate had other plans, as it so often does. The following Saturday, Richard announced that he would host a public demonstration to determine whether Tempest was truly cured. He invited ranchers from across the county, along with newspaper reporters and even a television crew from the city. The event would take place in the main arena, a space designed for horse shows and rodeos, with bleachers that could hold several hundred spectators. Richard framed it as a celebration of Tempest's recovery, but everyone understood the true purpose. This would be the moment when Eli's success or failure would be publicly declared, and when Richard's obligation would be either confirmed or denied. The morning of the demonstration dawned clear and bright. the kind of perfect Texas day that seemed designed for momentous occasions. Eli arrived at the ranch early, finding the place already buzzing with activity as workers set up chairs and refreshment stands. Tempest was in his stable, calm but alert, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. Eli spent an hour with him before the crowds arrived, speaking softly and running his hands along the horse's neck, reinforcing the bond that had become the foundation of Tempest's recovery. By noon, the bleachers were packed with spectators from across the county and beyond. Richard Thornton stood at the center of the arena, dressed in his finest Western wear, playing the role of gracious host while his lawyers huddled nearby, conferring in urgent whispers. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, a collective holding of breath as everyone waited to see what would happen. When Eli led Tempest into the arena, a murmur rippled through the crowd, followed by scattered applause that grew until it filled the space like thunder. Richard raised his hands for silence and addressed the crowd with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to public speaking. 3 weeks ago, he announced, "I made a challenge that many of you witnessed. I said that anyone who could cure this horse would win this ranch. At the time, I believed the task was impossible." He paused, letting the words sink in, then turned to look at Eli and Tempest, standing together in the afternoon sun. "Today we will determine whether that challenge has been met." The demonstration that followed was designed to test every aspect of Tempest's recovery. Professional handlers approached the horse to verify that he could be touched by strangers without reacting violently. A veterinarian examined him thoroughly, declaring his physical health excellent. Then came the true test, a series of obstacles and commands that would reveal whether Tempest could once again be ridden and controlled. The crowd watched in tense silence as each challenge was presented, and they cheered as each challenge was met. Tempest moved with grace and confidence, responding to Eli's gentle guidance as if they had been partners for years. When the final test was complete, Tempest standing calm and proud in the center of the arena, the veterinarian approached Richard with his assessment. "This horse is as healthy and well-adjusted as any I have examined," he announced loudly enough for all to hear. "Whatever was wrong with him before, he is cured now." The crowd erupted in cheers, but Eli barely heard them. His attention was fixed on Richard Thornton, whose face had become an unreadable mask. The moment of truth had arrived, and everyone present understood that what happened next would define not just the fate of a boy and a horse, but the character of a man. The arena fell silent as Richard Thornton stepped forward, his boots echoing against the packed earth with each deliberate stride. Every eye was fixed upon him, every breath held in anticipation of what he would say. The television cameras zoomed in on his weathered face, capturing the conflict that played across his features like clouds racing across a troubled sky. Behind him, his lawyers stood rigid with tension, their briefcases clutched like shields against whatever decision their client might make. This was the moment that would be remembered, the instant when a man's true nature would be revealed before hundreds of witnesses. Richard stopped a few feet from where Eli stood with Tempest, the boy's hand resting lightly on the horse's neck. For a long moment, the millionaire simply looked at them, this unlikely pair who had turned his world upside down. The boy met his gaze without flinching, those copper penny eyes reflecting nothing but patient waiting. There was no demand in his expression, no expectation or entitlement. Eli stood as he always stood, humble and unassuming, asking for nothing while somehow deserving everything. Richard felt the weight of every compromise he had ever made pressing down upon his shoulders. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he could not entirely conceal. "I have built my life on deals and negotiations," he began, his words carrying across the silent arena. "I have made promises when it suited me and broken them when the cost seemed too high. That is how business works, or so I always believed." He paused, swallowing hard against the tightness in his throat. 3 weeks ago, I made a promise in front of many of you. I said that whoever cured this horse would win this ranch. I meant it as a joke, a way of proving that some things cannot be fixed, not even with money. The crowd stirred uneasily, sensing that something unexpected was unfolding. Richard's lawyers began moving forward, ready to intervene, but he stopped them with a raised hand. This boy, he continued, gesturing toward Eli, came to me with nothing but bare feet and a willing heart. He had no training, no credentials, no experience that would qualify him for the task. But he had something that all my experts lacked. He understood that healing comes not from force or control, but from patience and love. He saw in Tempest what I was too blind to see, a creature that needed compassion, not conquest. Eli felt Tempest shift beside him, the horse pressing closer as if offering support. The boy's heart was pounding in his chest, though his face remained calm. He had learned long ago that showing fear or hope too openly only invited disappointment. Whatever Richard decided, Eli knew that he had already received the greatest reward possible, the transformation of a broken spirit into something whole and beautiful. The ranch had never been his goal, and he would not allow himself to want it now, not when wanting might lead to despair. Richard reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded document, the paper crisp and official-looking in the afternoon light. "My lawyers have advised me that there are ways to avoid honoring my promise," he said, his voice carrying a bitter edge. "They have found loopholes and technicalities, arguments that would hold up in any court. I could walk away from this without giving up a single acre, and most people would say I was smart to do so." He looked down at the document in his hands, then back up at Eli. "But I am tired of being that kind of man." A gasp rippled through the crowd as Richard unfolded the document and held it up for all to see. "This is the deed to Thornton Ranch," he announced, his voice stronger now, filled with a conviction that surprised even himself. 2,000 acres of prime Texas land, including the house, the stables, and everything on this property. As of this moment, it belongs to Elijah Cole, in recognition of a promise made and a miracle delivered. The arena erupted in chaos, shouts of disbelief mixing with cheers of approval, cameras flashing like lightning in a summer storm. Eli stood frozen, unable to process what he had just heard. His grandmother's warnings about disappointment echoed in his mind, making him doubt the evidence of his own ears. Surely this was some kind of trick, some cruel joke that would be revealed at any moment. But Richard was walking toward him now, the deed extended in his weathered hands, and there were tears streaming down the millionaire's face. Real tears, the kind that could not be faked, born of some profound shift that Eli did not yet understand. "Take it," Richard said, pressing the document into Eli's trembling hands. "You have earned it in ways that go far beyond our original agreement. You have shown me what I had forgotten, that there are things more valuable than property or profit. This ranch will be better in your hands than it ever was in mine." His voice broke on the final words, and he turned away quickly, embarrassed by the display of emotion that he could no longer contain. The crowd surged forward, surrounding Eli with congratulations and questions he could not begin to answer. Reporters thrust microphones toward his face, demanding to know how he felt, what he planned to do with his new fortune. But Eli barely heard them. His attention was fixed on Tempest, who stood calmly amid the chaos, a rock of steadiness in a swirling sea. The horse lowered his great head and pressed his muzzle against Eli's chest, and the boy wrapped his arms around that powerful neck, holding on as if his life depended upon it. When the initial frenzy had subsided and the crowds began to disperse, Eli found his grandmother standing at the edge of the arena. Martha Cole's face was wet with tears, her frail body trembling with emotions too large for words. She opened her arms, and Eli ran to her, burying his face against her shoulder the way he had done as a small child, seeking comfort from nightmares. But these were not tears of fear or sorrow. They were tears of joy, of vindication, of a future suddenly transformed beyond anything either of them had dared to imagine. That night, as stars emerged to blanket the Texas sky, Eli walked through the ranch that was now his own. Tempest walked beside him, their shadows stretching long across the moonlit grass. The magnitude of what had happened was only beginning to sink in, and Eli knew that the days ahead would bring challenges he could not yet foresee. But for now, in this perfect moment of peace and possibility, he allowed himself to simply feel grateful for a journey that had started with a raised hand and a willingness to try. The weeks following the transfer of the ranch brought changes that Eli could never have anticipated. His grandmother moved from the tiny cabin at the edge of town into the mansion's guest quarters, where she had access to proper heating, comfortable furniture, and the medical care that her condition required. A specialist from Houston examined her heart and prescribed treatments that had previously been far beyond their means. Color returned to her cheeks, strength returned to her limbs, and she began spending hours in the mansion's garden, coaxing flowers from soil that had been neglected for years. Richard Thornton did not disappear from their lives, as Eli had half expected. Instead, he took up residence in a modest house on the edge of the property, a former foreman's cottage that he renovated with his own hands. The physical labor seemed to ground him in ways that his previous life of luxury never had, and he could often be found working alongside the ranch hands, learning skills he had never bothered to acquire when he was paying others to do the work. The transformation in his demeanor was remarkable, the arrogance and coldness melting away to reveal a man hungry for connection and purpose. Eli found himself relying on Richard's knowledge of the ranch's operations, a partnership that surprised them both. The boy had no experience running a business of this scale, and Richard had decades of hard-won wisdom to share. They would sit together on the porch in the evenings, discussing everything from cattle prices to equipment maintenance, their conversations gradually expanding to include deeper topics. Richard spoke of his regrets, his failed marriage, his estranged daughter. Eli listened with the same patience he had shown Tempest, offering no judgment, only presence. The ranch hands, initially uncertain about working for a 12-year-old owner, quickly came to respect Eli's approach to leadership. He made no dramatic changes to their routines, imposed no new rules or demands. Instead, he spent time with each of them, learning their names and their stories, understanding their concerns and suggestions. Javier, the head ranch hand who had served under Richard for 15 years, became something of a mentor to the boy, teaching him the practical skills needed to run a working cattle operation. The others followed Javier's lead, and before long the ranch was functioning more smoothly than it had in years. Tempest remained Eli's constant companion through all of these changes. The horse had fully recovered his strength and spirit, his coat gleaming like polished copper in the Texas sun. He followed Eli everywhere, from the stables to the pastures to the main house, where he would wait patiently outside while the boy conducted business within. The bond between them had become legendary in the county, a story told and retold in feed stores and church gatherings, growing more elaborate with each telling. Some said the boy could read the horse's mind. Others claimed Tempest could understand human speech. The truth was simpler and more profound than any legend. One afternoon, about 2 months after the transfer of the ranch, a sleek black car pulled up the long driveway and parked in front of the mansion. Eli watched from the corral as a woman emerged, tall and elegant in a business suit that seemed out of place against the rustic backdrop. She stood for a moment looking at the house, her expression unreadable, then began walking toward the front door with purposeful strides. Something about her bearing triggered a memory, and Eli realized with a start that this must be Richard's daughter, the one who lived in New York and never called. Her name was Catherine, and she had come to confront her father about giving away her inheritance. The argument that followed could be heard throughout the ranch, her sharp voice cutting through the afternoon stillness like a blade. She accused Richard of senility, of being manipulated by a clever con artist, of throwing away everything her mother had helped him build. Richard's responses were quieter, harder to hear, but his tone carried a firmness that surprised those who remembered the man he had been. When Catherine finally emerged from the cottage, her face was flushed with anger and her eyes glistened with unshed tears. Eli intercepted her before she reached her car, stepping into her path with the same calm determination he had shown when facing her father's challenge weeks ago. Catherine stopped, startled by the appearance of this barefoot boy who now owned what she had always assumed would one day be hers. Her lips curled into a sneer, and she opened her mouth to deliver what would surely have been a devastating dismissal. But something in Eli's expression made her hesitate, some quality of genuine compassion that cut through her defensive anger. "Your father loves you," Eli said simply. "He talks about you all the time, about when you were young, about the things he wishes he had done differently. I know you are angry about the ranch, and maybe you have every right to be. But he did not give it away to hurt you. He gave it away because he needed to become a different person. And this was the only way he knew how. Catherine stared at him, her carefully constructed armor beginning to crack under the weight of his words. That evening, for the first time in over a decade, Richard and Catherine sat down together for dinner. Eli had arranged the meal in the cottage rather than the mansion, understanding instinctively that their grand house would only reinforce the barriers between father and daughter. He left them alone to talk, spending the hours with Tempest in the moonlit pasture, giving the fractured family the space they needed to begin healing. When he passed by the cottage later that night, he saw them still sitting together, their voices low and earnest, and he smiled. The reconciliation between Richard and Catherine did not happen overnight. There were more visits, more difficult conversations, tears and accusations that had been bottled up for years, finally finding release. But gradually, something new began to grow between them. A relationship built not on expectations or inheritance, but on genuine understanding. Catherine began visiting the ranch regularly, and though she never fully approved of her father's decision, she came to understand it. More importantly, she came to know the boy who had inspired it, and what she found in Eli challenged everything she had believed about the world. Months passed, and the ranch flourished under Eli's stewardship in ways that even the most optimistic observers had not predicted. The boy had a gift for seeing potential where others saw only problems, for inspiring loyalty in people and animals alike. Word spread of his methods, his patience, his remarkable ability to connect with horses that others had given up on. Soon other ranchers were bringing their troubled animals to him, seeking the same miracle he had worked on Tempest. A new chapter was beginning, one that would transform not just a single ranch, but an entire community. 5 years had passed since the day a barefoot boy raised his hand to accept an impossible challenge, and the Thornton Ranch, now known simply as Hope Ranch, had become something far greater than anyone could have imagined. The property that had once been a symbol of one man's wealth and pride had transformed into a sanctuary for wounded horses and the people who loved them. Eli, now 17 years old, had grown tall and strong, though his eyes still held that same gentle wisdom that had first drawn Tempest to trust him. The boy who had walked 3 miles each day in bare feet now oversaw an operation that employed dozens of people and had helped hundreds of animals find healing and purpose. The sanctuary had begun almost by accident, when neighboring ranchers started bringing their troubled horses to Eli after witnessing Tempest's miraculous recovery. Each animal arrived with its own story of trauma, abuse, or neglect, and each one received the same patient attention that Eli had given to Tempest. Word spread beyond the county, then beyond the state, until horse owners from across the country were seeking help for animals that traditional trainers had declared hopeless. Eli never turned anyone away, regardless of their ability to pay, and somehow the ranch always found the resources to continue its mission. Richard Thornton had become an integral part of this transformation, his business acumen channeled toward building sustainable programs that would ensure the sanctuary's survival for generations to come. He established a foundation in Eli's name, soliciting donations from wealthy contacts who had once been his rivals and competitors. The man who had once measured success only in terms of profit now found fulfillment in watching broken creatures made whole. His relationship with Catherine had healed as well, and she had eventually relocated to Texas, using her corporate skills to manage the foundation's growing operations. Martha Cole lived to see her grandson's dream flourish, though her heart finally gave out on a peaceful spring morning when the wildflowers she had planted were in full bloom. Eli buried her in a quiet corner of the ranch, beneath a spreading oak tree, where she had loved to sit and watch the horses graze. Tempest stood beside him throughout the service, a silent sentinel honoring the woman who had raised the boy who had saved him. In the weeks that followed, Eli often found himself at her grave, speaking to her as he had once spoken to Tempest, sharing his thoughts and fears and hopes with someone who had always listened without judgment. Tempest himself had grown old gracefully, his muzzle now flecked with gray, and his movements slower than they had once been. But his spirit remained undiminished, and he still followed Eli around the ranch with the same devotion he had shown from the beginning. The younger horses in the sanctuary seemed to sense his importance, treating him with a deference that went beyond mere herd dynamics. He had become a teacher of sorts, helping newly arrived animals understand that this place was safe, that the humans here could be trusted. His presence alone was often enough to calm the most frightened and aggressive horses. The story of Eli and Tempest had been told so many times that it had taken on the quality of legend. Books had been written about them, documentaries filmed, and countless articles published in magazines around the world. But Eli remained unchanged by the attention, still preferring the company of horses to crowds of admirers. He had discovered that his gift extended beyond simply healing individual animals, that he could teach others to develop similar connections with horses and with each other. The training programs he developed attracted students from around the globe, young people who left Hope Ranch with skills and insights that would transform their own communities. One evening, as the sun painted the Texas sky in shades of orange and gold, Eli walked through the pastures with Tempest at his side. They moved slowly, accommodating the old horse's stiff joints, stopping frequently to greet the other animals that grazed peacefully in the fading light. There were nearly 50 horses on the ranch now, each one a testament to the power of patience and love. Some would eventually be adopted into forever homes. Others would live out their days in this sanctuary, cared for by people who understood their worth beyond any monetary measure. Richard joined them as they reached the hill overlooking the main compound, his own steps slower than they had once been, but his eyes bright with contentment. The three of them stood together watching the sunset. This unlikely family formed not by blood but by choices and circumstances and the mysterious workings of fate. None of them spoke. Words were unnecessary between souls that had learned to communicate in deeper ways. The peace that surrounded them was almost tangible, a living thing that had grown from the seeds of compassion planted years ago. As darkness gathered and stars began to emerge, Eli thought about all that had happened since that day when he first saw Tempest chained and suffering in the corral. He had learned that true strength had nothing to do with power or wealth, that the greatest victories were won through surrender rather than conquest. He had discovered that healing others was inseparable from healing oneself, that every act of compassion created ripples that spread far beyond what the eye could see. And he had found a purpose that gave meaning to every breath, every step, every moment of his existence. Tempest pressed his graying muzzle against Eli's shoulder, a gesture that had become their private ritual of affection and gratitude. The young man wrapped his arm around the horse's neck, feeling the steady pulse of life beneath the warm hide. They had saved each other, he realized, in ways that went far beyond the physical. The boy who had been dismissed by the world had found his calling, and the horse who had been broken by cruelty had found his peace. Together they had proven that miracles were possible for those brave enough to believe in them. The legacy they had created would continue long after both of them were gone. The seeds of kindness they had planted would bear fruit for generations, touching lives they would never know. And somewhere, in pastures yet to be established, horses yet to be born would find healing because of what had begun with a millionaire's arrogant bet and a humble boy's raised hand. This was not just their story. It was a reminder that love, patience, and faith could transform even the most hopeless situations into something beautiful. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to like, share, and leave a comment telling me what you thought. I would love to know where in the world you are watching from, and whether you enjoy these stories about the extraordinary bonds between humans and animals. And if you have not already, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new story. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and may you always find the courage to believe in miracles.